it's so rare that we get an opportunity to kind of stand back and reflect on where the subject has been for a number of years, where it's going, and especially to do this in conjunction with a book which was my first book in game theory. Actually, although Eric is technically right that he probably taught the first graduate course at MIT on game theory, I took a course from Bob Solow, the title of which was Linear Economic Theory, which had a mixture of linear programming and two-person zero-sum and some other game theory, which used Lucen Refa and also Gale's book on linear economic models. And as you can imagine, anybody who's heard Bob Solow talk, that was just a wonderful, wonderful start. I'm going to, again, perhaps picking up on whether we should be talking of game theory or game engineering or game science or what have you, talking about from the perspective of somebody who's used game theory rather than created any game theory. Tom Schelling said that he was a user of game theory rather than game theorist, and I think he's totally wrong. He's been instrumental in creating a whole lot of our concepts and frameworks of game theory over a number of years. But I'm really a user. I've used it in a variety of contexts, and this gave me an opportunity to kind of stand back, collect my thoughts, give a little bit of a jumbled organization. And the jumbling is for the reason not that I haven't thought about it, but that every day I think about it, I think of a slightly different way of organizing that. And so the jumble is where I stand today and may not be where I'll stand tomorrow. Up front, a couple of kind of general reflections that I got from thinking about this, one of which came up from time after time in yesterday's talks and today also in what Eric was saying, that what we now think of as an overall game theoretic framework, specific examples of this were implicit in a lot of economic literature for quite a long time. And still, it's useful to have that general framework because we don't have to kind of reinvent a number of the concepts and solutions every time we try and apply them. We have a ready-made toolkit that we can use. So even though people might say such and such was a precursor, the fact that we now have gone beyond that is still immensely useful. In fact, we've gone so much beyond that game theory now we can say is pretty much the dominant mode of thinking in large areas of economics. Instead of the supply-demand cross, we have trees and payoff matrices. Some of Roger's Chicago colleagues probably would not agree with that, but I would argue that even Steve Levitt is actually, in a lot of what he does, a game theorist. Secondly, although I come from one spectrum of the theorist versus user distinction, if you like, the more you think about it, the more you recognize that it actually is a spectrum, that the people usually kind of move back and forth, as Eric himself has done, and there's been a feedback from users into theoretical ideas and vice versa. So we really should be thinking of a continuum at which I'll be looking at from more or less one end. Few examples. I'm going to kind of fly these by you where I think the audience knows actually a lot more than I do, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about things that some of you may know less about. So, of course, kind of things that were implicitly game theory, Cournot and Bertrand going on for a long time, Edgeworth's contract curve, again leading to the core, was kind of implicitly game theoretic. Coming to more recent times, like 50, 60 years ago, a lot of social choice theory also was implicitly game theoretic, although it was not formally made game theoretic until a little bit later. I think Bob Wilson had one of the early papers on this, no? Game theoretic formulation of the arrow impossibility theorem, am I right? And something that people may not know is Harry Johnson wrote a paper in 1953 on tariff wars. So two large countries setting trade restrictions against each other. By trade restrictions, they can improve their terms of trade, the prices of their exports versus the prices of their imports, but of course they'll succeed in selling less. That's a kind of bilateral monopoly monopsony situation, and he had pretty much everything done right. So you have to work out the general equilibrium of trade given the tariff rates of the two countries. Then you have to construct the two reaction curves in tariff space, etc., find what we would call a Nash equilibrium, compare that, show why it's inefficient, and what would be better possibilities, etc., etc., without ever once mentioning Nash or any of these game theoretic concepts. It's actually an interesting paper to go back to. Also, information economics was initially completely non-game theoretic. Akerlof's Lemons paper actually had simple supply-demand model in that. Spence, likewise, actually, Spence, you know, in the way in which Mike kind of jokingly talks of his own work, said to me once that people always ask me, is that equilibrium perfect? And I tell them, I don't know about perfect, but it's good enough for me. Then gradually, explicit game theory began to come in. And although, again, we talk these days mostly of non-cooperative game theory, one of my first kind of wow moments, hey, isn't this real cool, was reading the Broskov paper on core conversions. One very early papers I read in my graduate work. Then again, Bob Wilson's work on auctions. I love those papers in the late 60s or sort of 67, 69 kind of for 2 or 3 reasons. Not the least of which is that they're really short papers. In 5 pages, he gets all kinds of things, including how to properly cope with the winner's curse. That's kind of implicit in the equilibrium framework and all that kind of thing. These days, people write 60 and 70-page papers with far, far less content, and I think that's kind of a retrograde movement. And also, I think those papers were one of the very first ones that really made use of the Harsanyi framework, which had only just come in, and that's second reason for liking and going back and reading those papers. Then Eric talked about Hurwitz, Gibbard, etc., that started to become more explicitly game theoretic. Nash's bargaining solution was used as a kind of simple way of formalizing a number of ideas in labor economics. Orly Ashenfelter, for example, was one of the early ones to use that. And later on, toward this period, later in the 70s, more extensive form bargaining theories began to come along, and a whole lot of other fields that I'll come to one by one. Microeconomics and I/O, I just want to kind of throw out what I have gotten out of this more than anything else, which is kind of general view of competition. Think of supply-demand. Well, there's price and quantity, and those are kind of the stars on the stage. A supply curve and demand curve, and everything else that happens, R&D, advertising, etc., are thought of as either demand shifters or cost shifters. Start thinking game theoretically, and you get a much kind of richer, unified view of what competition is. All these are kind of just different dimensions of strategy. And maybe some of them will be set before others are, so there'll be multi-stage games, etc. But it's all part of just one picture. It's not that somehow price setting is the main thing and all these other things are somewhere background. Perfect competition. So the textbooks talk of price-taking behavior, but think about it in this kind of a general, richer framework. And you'll see that we really ought to think of perfect competition as expected utility-taking behavior. Firms are delivering utilities to consumers in a variety of different ways, and to attract them, you've got to offer at least as much as others are offering. So perfect competition will be where you take that as parametric, and a firm will be trying to maximize its expected profit, subject to the constraint that it's got to deliver at least U star the opportunity that consumers will get as expected utility. And then if there's free entry, the max of that problem will turn out to equal 0. Flip that around, and what's happening is that each firm is implicitly forced by competition, maximizing the expected utility it delivers to consumers, subject to not making a loss. And the solution to that problem will be then the utility in equilibrium. A lot of things that are done. For example, if you want to prove that pure moral hazard problem with insurance, the contract is constrained Pareto optimal, that's kind of thing that Polinsky and Chauvel, for example, had early papers on. They're all part of this framework, and this in kind of just one chunk will give you that in a much richer way. In I/O, of course, is where game theory really came of age, and non-cooperative game theory became much more prominent. A whole lot of these were mentioned one way or the other in the talk, so I don't think I need to dwell on those to any extent. Labor economics, actually I mentioned the first item here solely because it's kind of natural to think of bargaining in the labor context, but many, many wider uses of that are in Howard's book on the art and science of negotiation. And I just realized that that book was written in 1982. So we happen to have a kind of double anniversary. This is the 25th anniversary of that book and the 50th anniversary of Luce and Rafa. I and a number of others have gotten an immense amount of that book. The way in which multiple issues and multiple parties interact, the role played by things like a single negotiating text, variety of applications. That then led on to all these kind of things, getting to yes and all that kind of thing, right? So a number of others taking inspiration from that have made their millions. Search theory is another important part of labor economics, and that's much more to do with decision theory. We shouldn't forget the decisions part of Luce and Rafa, and this is where a lot of it finds application. Matching theory is important in labor again, and we talked a little bit yesterday about Gail Shapley. One other useful thing is that labor is kind of primarily an empirical field where there's a whole lot of rich data available, and that's another kind of opportunity for game theorists to make use of some of that data for testing, estimation, etc., for alternative theoretical ideas, and that's kind of beginning to happen. So not just in labor, but as richer data become available in other areas, so like work by Athey and Haley on auctions and all that kind of thing is worth making a note of. In macroeconomics and public economics, games are of a rather peculiar nature. There's one large player, the government, and a number of small players, the private sector. And so if you think of them in a game theoretic two-stage way, the government is choosing its policy knowing that at the second stage there'll be more a kind of Walrasian rational expectations augmented, etc., equilibrium. That's more in macro, which leads more to the question of dynamic inconsistency, etc., commitment and lack of commitment, different kinds of implications for policy. One of the early, most important papers in the public finance area was, of course, Jim Murley's income tax paper, which is in some way a kind of precursor of mechanism design. A number of ideas like single crossing, monotonicity, and their roles in the way in which incentive constraints can be simplified. In fact, a kind of literal germ, if you like, of even the revelation principle can be found in that. And that, of course, became much more explicit, much more famous for following the formulation by Meyerson, Rosenthal, Dasgupta, Maskin, Hammond, etc., and in applications made really famous by the Baron-Meyerson paper, which is in a way to regulation IO what the Morley's paper was to income tax theory. International economics is another kind of area of my own interest, and one of the places where game theory began to be applied much more specifically was in strategic trade policy. These are kind of two-stage games where one or two governments are active at the first stage, and at the second stage, there again, instead of being a kind of large atomistic private sector, there are large firms. So firms are playing an oligopoly of their own, given the policies set by the government, and then the kinds of policies the governments might set to give their own national firms an advantage become the crucial question. Are there going to be policies that will enable your firm to be more aggressive in the foreign market, or more passive and accommodating in its dealing with the other country's firm? And that turns out to depend on another of these beautiful little papers by Fudenberg and Tirol on the fat cat effect, the puppy dog fly, and the lean and hungry look. That came a little bit after the initial papers on strategic trade policy appeared, but nowadays we kind of teach that whole subject, at least I do, in that kind of framework, the classification of are best response curves upward sloping or downward sloping, and does commitment shift the best response curves to the right or the left. Second area where game theory was successively made more and more explicit was in discussions of trade liberalization agreements. These raise a couple of interesting issues. One of them is that there's no kind of a real supranational authority that will impose penalties on a country that doesn't live up to its agreements. So agreements have to be self-enforcing. Any kind of punishments that are agreed have to be imposed by other countries. And that needs, first of all, a repeated interaction. But second of all, problem of this kind would arise. A is importing from B and violates its agreement to keep import tariffs down by putting some kind of other import restrictions, quotas, or other kinds of barriers. So B is the aggrieved party and wants A punished. But there may be nothing relevant that B itself buys from A where it could retaliate. It may well be that C, D, or some other countries have to retaliate on B's behalf, although they themselves have nothing direct to gain by doing that. So you need multilateral enforcement in a kind of self-sustaining equilibrium framework. And once you realize what needs to be done, there's nothing necessarily tricky about constructing models of this kind, but it's the realization as it's embodied then in the models. There's a model by Giovanni Maggi, for example, that was one of the early ones in this area that are worth noting. More recently, as the European Central Bank deals with representation by a dozen or more countries' central banks with somewhat different interests on whether monetary policy at any given time should be more expansionary or more restrictive, become amenable to game theoretic analysis. The way in which countries' representatives will vote on the central bank, knowing the way in which the rules operate becomes a game. And there's also a game in which there's the central bank, which itself is playing a game, but it's playing in the presence of separate national treasuries, which are setting fiscal policies, because fiscal policy is not coordinated in the way that monetary policy is in the ECB. So that becomes a trickier game still, and I've played around with those kind of games. Chari and Kehoe and people like that have written on that. Again, an interesting, fruitful area of uses of game theory that's been developing. Political economy we talked about quite a bit. Again, this is one of these things that people know a lot about, so I don't think I need to spend a great deal of time over, except for one branch that people may not know so much about, namely the middle one there on delegation. What's happening here is that legislatures, for example, are not able to anywhere near acquire all the information that they'll need for their decision making. They've got to rely on experts that will get some of that information for them. But of course, they've got to recognize that those experts will have their own agendas, their own interests, and will try and twist the legislature's decision-making in certain directions. Those experts may be a small subcommittee of the legislature itself, or they may be administrators, bureaucrats, etc., amount somewhat to the same kind of thing. So this is ultimately a mechanism design problem, how to deal with those agents, including in this case the possibility that you don't follow their recommendations. You've got to include that, and that's the kind of thing that will keep the agents from departing too far from the preferences of, for example, the median voter in the legislature. So let me now spend a little bit more time on what's my own current interest, which is the way in which a variety of social institutions, formal and informal, operate or could be designed to operate better, etc., to solve a whole lot of collective decision and action problems in societies. As far as economics is concerned, there are kind of two real main problems, were the protection of property rights and enforcement of contracts. That's the kind of legal aspect. And secondly, provision of a whole lot of public goods, which may involve coordination problems, solving prisoner's dilemma problems, etc., etc. Now, of course, we in America, Western Europe, etc., are inclined to say, hey, let's just write laws. Let's have a law that says property rights are protected, contracts will be enforced, etc. But even in the US, doing those things through courts is costly. And in a vast majority of cases, something like 90% of cases where some kind of disputes arise in business dealings, they're settled by negotiation and not by going to court. Trust plays a very important role even here. In a whole lot of other countries, these formal institutions either don't exist at all, or they're very new and still very imperfect, or they're biased, or they're corrupt. So examples are that if you take a business contract to court in India, it will take you some 300 years for your case to come up. The backlog is that long. Of course, that's a little bit of a caricature. If you've got a good lawyer, he or she will know how to cut through that system and get your case heard faster. But then, of course, the other side has probably a good lawyer, too, who can slow it down. So what are these cases that are clogging up the courts? And they're very often family disputes over estates and so on that have gotten so kind of emotional that the parties are willing to fight them to the end. And so business contracts have to rely on a whole lot of informal mechanisms, which are things like social networks and norms, or in some cases, enforcement by third parties done for a profit. Very often, organized crime does these kind of things. And so one of the fun things I've found in this business is building, so to speak, mathematical models of the mafia. And people suggested that I should go into consulting on the basis of that, but I've resisted that so far. Prisoners' dilemmas in provision of public goods or other kind of coordination problems may sometimes need somewhat simpler solutions, to the extent that they're kind of assurance games, where if everybody else is doing the right thing, it's in your own interest to do the right thing as well. And then basically what you need is an institution that will create a focal point. In other cases where there are prisoners' dilemmas or maybe chicken-type games, a variety of norms, punishments, etc. might be necessary. Tom Schelling was talking about this, and he gave an excellent example of an assurance game where there's an intersection, cars or other vehicles passing through. There's the maybe not common understanding of the laws, etc. So he goes and puts up a traffic light. This traffic light put up here by courtesy of Professor Schelling, and that solves the problem. So what I want to do is to show you a couple of examples of how this actually works. Let me see if I can get this. No, I can't get the cursor to come in here. I don't know why. No, Vietnam. I should thank my former student and friend, Danny Roderick, who pointed me to these videos. So now we can, yeah, okay. So this is an example of what Ellickson would call order without law. There are no formal rules, but there's enough of kind of common understanding, adherence to norms, etc., that keeps the system functioning. And on the other hand, the St. Petersburg case is one where there is a law. There are red lights and green lights. Some people just don't believe that red lights mean that you should stop, and then there are others who believe that green lights give you the right to go through the intersection. And you see the result of what happens. And I've been wondering what the difference between those is, and I'd love to get some discussion on this, and I'm sure Tom will have some ideas. Is it that the speeds are so low in the Vietnam case that people have time to look, react, slow down, turn, etc., etc.? Or is it that basically in the Vietnam situation, it's an open situation where pedestrians, bicycles, etc., they're not enclosed in cars. They're able to see each other and see what the other person is doing, etc., whereas drivers in cars can't actually see each other, and other than looking at the speed of the car, etc., have no good way to understand that. So is this kind of situation that Tom talks about in his work on the fear of surprise attack? You have kind of, so to speak, in the Vietnam situation, a good enough second strike capability. It's equivalent kind of second accident avoidance capability, whereas that exists to a much lesser extent in the St. Petersburg situation. We were very interested to think seriously, game theoretically, about the difference between those. Let me kind of quickly wrap up a little bit, and then maybe we can come back to this. I want to give some random thoughts again on what I think could be or should be done over the next several years in a number of these areas. First of them is the connection with behavioral or limitedly rational or constrained rational, or however you want to express it, evidence approaches, etc., that have been accumulating in a quite compelling way over the last several years. Of course, that's not entirely kind of one-sided. It's not entirely the case that there was a rational decision theory and game theory coming from von Neumann, Savage, Milner, Lucen-Refa, etc., and that's been destroyed by Taylor or Kammerer or whatever. I'm sure even those people would not think that. Also, some other experimental work, particularly field experiments done by List and company, have shown that in some situations where normally experienced people play in situations where egos are not really at stake, emotions are not really at stake, in basically market-like situations, a lot of the conventional theory works pretty well. So it's important to recognize where each kind of context falls on, if you like, a spectrum between purely rational, perfect calculating kind of approaches and a variety of alternative ones. So I really love the parallel that Tom Schelling gave us yesterday, that magnetic compasses work fine on a large part of the globe. The parts of the globe where errors start to mount, where you have a better or worse idea of the size of those errors, etc. Right close to the magnetic poles, things will go horribly wrong, and if you're directly between the geographic pole and the magnetic pole, the compass will point exactly the wrong way. So we have a good understanding there of the way in which the compass works or does not work in different situations. And same kind of way, we need a kind of better understanding, a more nuanced understanding of where rational approaches work, where they will work to a good approximation, where we need to depart from them in a more serious way, etc., etc. And mapping out that kind of a terrain, I think, is going to be a very important part of the research agenda for the next several years. credibility. Now, we have all done models of subgame perfectness and the know when a threat or a promise is credible. The theories give you basically 0-1 answers. Either the equilibrium is subgame perfect or it's not. Either something is credible or is not. Think in kind of an ordinary person's way, and you'll think in terms of degrees of credibility. How credible is something? Now, you could, in a Harsanyi type way, have the idea that there are players of a type that have commitment ability and those that don't, or something like that, and model it that way. But I'm not 100% sure that's going to be good enough. I have a kind of gut feeling that I can't properly articulate that capturing in a good way the concept of degree of credibility needs a little bit more than that. And it almost falls into the third thing that I want to, again, mention. The research is coming along on this, games without common knowledge, or what are increasingly called games of incomplete awareness, where a game is played and you then think, somebody does something and think, who would have thunk they could do that? So people always bring up these examples when I'm talking about equilibria, etc. Well, in a frivolous way, if you like. A good example of this is, how many of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride? Very few. Okay. There's this. I'll explain it a little bit. Actually, I wish I'd known that. I would have brought that clip along. So there's this famous scene where the hero challenges the villain, who believes himself to be really, really smart, to a battle of wits, where he will poison one of 2 wine cups, and the villain will decide who drinks from which one. So the villain goes through all kinds of convoluted arguments as to which one it should be, but of course in the natural way of games in which only a mixed strategy equilibrium exists, all those arguments are self-defeating. And finally believes that he's got the answer, drinks, and he's laughing, believing he's won, when he drops dead. And then the princess, who's over whom this fight was, says to the hero, Wesley, so all the time it was the cup in front of you that was poison. And he says, actually, they're both poisoned. I'm immune to that poison. I've built up immunity. So now, is this capable of being captured in a standard kind of types framework? Should we think of a game in which the 2 types of Wesleys, immune and non-immune, and do all that kind of thing? And if you did that, how many of these left field possibilities should the villain Vizzini include in his thinking in the first place? How do you model this? So actually, it turns out that, now I forget who it was who actually gave a paper that used this as a motivating example, and then began to develop a whole lot of framework of language for talking about these kind of things. And I have to say I got lost in that framework. But for me, kind of evidence that this isn't yet complete is that he never came back to tell us what actually should happen in the Princess Bride example. That started out by motivating the paper and then just disappeared. So to be successful for a user, that line has a long, long way to go. And I hope that advances in molecular biology and medicine and so on being so much faster than those in economics or game theory, in 50 years' time, all of us will come back to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Luce and Rafa, and maybe we'll have answers to some of these questions. But here's a thought for people who are asking, like, is everything disintegrating or making progress, etc. research will never end. If we come back in another 50 years, we'll have another set of questions that have grown out of the ones we solve. And here's a beautiful reflection in that. I don't know how many of you are fans of these things called grooks, that actually a Danish guy writing under a Dutch name wrote a number of years ago. They're accompanied by lovely little pictures. Anyway, this one, problems worthy of attack, prove their worth by hitting back, and that will keep on happening to us all the time, I'm sure. So I hope I've raised some questions to which I hope to get some answers immediately, and maybe some later on. So I would actually love to hear what Tom thinks about the traffic lights or non-traffic lights.
I was going to make a comment. 25 years ago, I was in Beijing, and I had to cross a very wide street. And the density of bicycles, I would say, was at least 1,000 per 100 yards. I started walking very carefully across. I had to get across. There was no place to find a traffic light. And I watched very carefully, and at one point I felt I'd better slow down or stop momentarily, and 14 people hit the pavement. The one closest to me was an elderly woman, and I held out my hand to help her up, and she was so incensed at what I had done that she wouldn't even take my hand. And I later asked somebody, what did I do wrong? And they said the answer is very simple. To cross a street like that, you walk in a straight line at constant speed and discipline yourself not to watch the bicycle. Behave unpredictably, 14 people are going to fall off their bikes.
So all the locals understand that norm, and when they abide by that, you have a good equilibrium. What goes wrong in St. Petersburg? What would be the way to improve on that?
You know, Russians drink a great deal.
What was that?
I don't know, actually. So clearly it was 2 or 3 days, or maybe even longer.
I live half a year per year in Estonia, which is 100 kilometers from St. Petersburg. And I have lived in and driven a bike in Marrakesh. In Estonia, people are angry at other people in traffic. In Marrakesh, they are not angry. And I think that makes a difference.
But I mean, one would think that Estonia, from the former Soviet Union, is about as close to the West as you get.
Yes, there's an enormous difference, but there is this similar attitude of anger, so that I can, no, Estonia is not like St. Petersburg, but I can understand.
Okay.
Avinash, I think the villain in The Princess Bride definitely showed himself to be not very smart. Because if the villain were very smart, he would have asked the other person to drink first. Because if he asks the other person to drink first, I mean, in some ways, that then indicates that it can't happen. Now, of course, the villain has said that he's willing to go first. And this is the old Green Knight problem in Arthurian romance. One of you gets your head chopped off, and the Green Knight goes to Gawain and says, "Okay, if I survive your sword stroke, then you must accept the sword stroke in return." And of course, the Green Knight, being invulnerable, survives the sword stroke, and then Gawain, I forgot exactly what happens. Gawain then owes him a favor thereafter. But there have to be other ways of doing it, and The Princess Bride is not the first example of this. The famous one, which probably shows that I'm probably even older than you are, is Danny Kaye and Glynis Johns in The Court Jester, which has where Danny Kaye
The vessel of yes.
King of jesters and jesters to kings. And it goes through a whole does the pestle,
Yeah.
does the vessel with the pestle
Pestle.
have the brew that is
It's
true?
true. The chalice from the palace.
Where he put the poison.
Absolutely right. But no, I think the rules were that they were to drink simultaneously, and I don't know to what extent they're malleable, etc. But going even before Danny Kaye, at least as far as the writing is concerned, but not as far as the movie is concerned, I think, is Guys and Dolls, where Sky Masterson, who's been asked to take a stupid bet, says that when I started out in this world, my father told me that one day a guy is going to come to you and bet that he can make the Jack of Spades jump out of a sealed pack of cards and squirt cider in your ear. Son, do not bet this man, because sure as we are standing here, you're going to end up with a earful of cider. But when you're offered an unknown quantity like that, it behooves you to be suspicious. The problem is, how suspicious? There are zillions of ways to be suspicious. Actually, just before the poison scene, if you remember, the bad prince is measuring various kinds of things where Wesley and the Spaniard fought a duel, etc., and draws some conclusions from that as to where they should pursue. And his assistant asks, do you think this could be a trap? And he says, I think everything could be a trap. That's why I'm still alive. So, I mean, there are a number of these kind of things in folklore, if you like. The question is, can we develop good theoretical frameworks, methods for dealing with them?
I didn't understand exactly the point about the traffic. The multiplicity of equilibria, various types. There are places where there's no equilibria.
Yeah.
What is the question?
Oh, but actually the more puzzling one is the St. Petersburg one, where there is a focal point. There are traffic lights, red lights, green lights, which will work out here but don't work there at considerable cost. So merely kind of putting up a traffic light is not enough. And actually, in the same kind of way, there are laws that say that people who do certain criminal acts will be punished, etc., which depend ultimately on the willingness of the enforcers of the law, the police, the courts, etc., to go along. And that itself is a game. Actually, there's a start on this paper by Melas, Morris, and Postowet, but it's so far more in the nature of pointing out the problem than actually finding a solution. So yesterday we had this story of, was it Tom was telling that? Would be of Batista's troops refusing to fire on the rebels, and everybody drew the conclusion that that was the end of that regime.
One in between, just to,
Yeah.
so in real life, I was visiting a game theory center in Argentina and was taken around, driven by the police. And when we get to a stop sign, repeatedly, he never stops in the stop sign. He just goes right through. I said, how come they always go through the stop sign? Because if I stop them, run into me from behind. So the equilibrium is against the sign, and it's very rational to violate it. St. Petersburg is not as
long as you understand the full way in which the thing works. Also, there are kind of local things. So I was told that in Pittsburgh, the custom is that when the light turns green, the first car that's waiting to turn left gets a protected left turn. There isn't a green arrow, but it's just understood that you allow the first car to go. And visitors probably would not know that.
I have another one. I lived in Paris a long time ago. To get to my apartment from where I worked, I had to go about 3/4 of the way around the Arc de Triomphe, which had about 6 lanes of traffic, all circling, and there were no white lines. And for about the first couple of weeks, I kept getting into the damnedest traffic snarls. It didn't hurt my brand new car, but close to it. And I kept wondering, how come it happens to me? It isn't happening to all the other people. And then I was told the rule, just as 25 years later I was told in Beijing. The rule was, keep your eye on the car on your right. Don't look left. The guy on your left is watching you. The guy on your right is not watching you. He's watching the person on his right. And as long as everybody abides by that rule, and if you know the rule, you abide by it. Because as long as you know that he's watching you and he's not, then it's better for you to watch the one on your right. And once I learned that, it just went swimmingly.
Yeah, but again, in St. Petersburg, it should work, but it doesn't. So
What period of time is that over?
That I don't know, unfortunately. It was clearly several days. It was kind of day followed night, etc. But it's still bad.
But it was a short period.
Yeah, presumably, yeah.
Several
I don't imagine that whoever it was had patience to kind of, but at the same intersection having the kind of dozen or more pretty horrible accidents that we saw, it's
But that was over a 10-year period.
No, it wouldn't be 10.
It
Certainly
can't be a
not.
short period, because someone has to clear the red cars.
Yeah,
away.
yeah,
I'm
exactly.
sorry?
It can't be a short period, because someone has to clear the red cars.
Depends on what you mean by short.
I don't know why.
And night was following day, etc. It was clearly several days.
I don't know if you've been in Russia, but people are drunk. This is the explanation. There's nothing in Russia. Actually, you don't need to go very far for it. Los Angeles, if you're used to driving in London, and then you have to drive in LA. There's a place where I used to live in Pasadena where you have to join a big freeway, and I had to cross 8 lanes to turn left. And if you did what you have to do in LA to get across those 8 lanes in London, there would be an accident. But people driving really fast, but they know people are going to cross the lanes. And in England, you're not allowed to overtake on the inside, but it's terrifying in LA because people are overtaking great trucks and great rigs. It takes me a week when I come to LA to learn again that I can do that and I won't be dead. If you cross the road in Naples, Naples is one of these places, and nobody pays any attention to traffic signals. And the only way you cross the road is the only way you cross the road is you put your foot in your hand and you run into the road. And the drivers know that's the only way to cross the road. They're ready for it. In New York, you'd be dead.
So this is an application of game theory to anthropology, or the other way around. This is cultures.
That's exactly right.
There was a Robin Williams movie where he played an alien from outer space and he was supposed to infer humans' rules from human behavior. So he was figuring out the traffic rules, and he worked out that green light means go, and red light means stop, and yellow light means drive as fast as you can.
It's true. Well, we're a couple of minutes over.